Hi, writers. Welcome back to the Writing Lab with Eva Pohler. I'm Eva Pohler, USA Today bestselling author of over 45 novels, an educator as a writing professor for over 3 decades, and an editor. And today I want to dive into the really important topic about showing versus telling. And I'd like to use some terms that Seymour Chatman wrote in his book, Coming to Terms, back in 1990. This has to do with story versus discourse, okay? So I want you to think of story as the actions that the characters take or the experiences that they have in the world of the story, okay? And I want you to think of the discourse as the telling of that story, the narration, the way the story is told is the discourse. So you have the world of the story and you have the world of the discourse, okay? Now, when it comes to things like scenes and summary and commentary and description and ellipsis, we're going to have different ratios between the world of the story and how it's represented by the telling of the story, okay? And what we want to do is we want to maximize what are called scenes. When you have a scene, the story time is equal to the amount of time it takes to tell it. And that's what makes it a scene. A reader feels like they are experiencing it in real time. So here's an example of a scene to help you understand what I'm talking about. Jim sat alone in the park, wondering where he had gone wrong. The evening sun beat down on him, baking his cheeks, turning them redder than they'd been when Eleanor had left him. Had she not liked the restaurant? Had the waiter been rude to her? Maybe Jim hadn't looked at her often enough across the table as she relayed her little stories about her day. They'd been interesting enough. Or perhaps he should have told more of his own stories. Maybe she'd mistaken his silence for lack of interest. A stray dog, thin, covered in sticker burrs and limping, approached the bench, bringing Jim from his thoughts. Jim scratched the dog behind the ears. "You're abandoned too, are you, boy?" So it took about the same amount of time for the narrator to tell what was happening as it was for Jim to experience the thoughts, the action of the dog coming up. All of that felt like it was in real time, and that's a scene. And that's what you want to focus on more. That's showing and not telling. Now, another type of narrative is the summary. And the summary is where the story time is almost infinitely greater than the discourse time. The story just isn't being represented in the discourse. So here's an example of a summary. Jim sat on a bench in the park, wondering where he had gone wrong on his date until a dog approached him. So in this summary, we don't get to hear all the thoughts he's having as he thinks about his date, or we don't get to see the dog actually approach him and scratch behind the ears. It's just a quick narrative that's very, very small, and the story there's so much more that really happened, right? And this is an example of telling. Now, sometimes you need to have these little summary statements to help us go from scene to scene. Okay, so I don't want you to think that summary is bad. No, summary is useful. All of these are useful, but it's about maximizing scenes and using the others as transitions. Okay, the next type of narrative device is description. Now, when you have description, the story time is actually a little less or shorter than the discourse time because the narrative slows down as the narrator is taking time to describe all these little things. Now, this goes in and out of fashion. Sometimes readers love all that description. I mean, think of Tolkien, think of The Lord of the Rings, and think of, all the descriptions of, everything there and how much, people enjoy that. But there are a lot of people who don't. A lot of people get bogged down, readers get bogged down if there's too much detail. And that's how authors are, different in their styles. It's part of our writing style. The best thing to do, though, is to try to not go overboard with the description so that you don't slow down the pacing of your novel. And it also might depend on what genre you're writing in, right? So here's an example of a description where the story time is shorter than the discourse time, right? Or the narrating of the story. Jim, a tall redhead in his mid-20s with dark round eyes, sat alone on a park bench beneath the hot evening sun. The bench was worn and written on. Lovers had put their initials inside hand-drawn hearts. People of all ages, shapes, and sizes strolled past on the trail, made of pea gravel and fallen leaves. Birds chirped from the tree branches overhead. But none of this mattered to Jim, who was red-cheeked and burning with humiliation, and most of all hurt that Eleanor had said no to a second date. Where had he gone wrong? Had she not liked the restaurant? Had the waiter been rude to her? Maybe Jim hadn't looked at her often enough across the table as she relayed her little stories about her day. They'd been interesting enough. Or perhaps he should have told more of his own stories. Maybe she'd mistaken his silence for lack of interest. A stray dog approached the bench, bringing Jim from his thoughts. The dog was short and long, like a dachshund, but covered in curly hair, like a poodle. It walked with a slight limp and was excessively thin, as if it hadn't eaten in days. There were sticker burrs matted in his fur, and one of its eyes was red and oozing pus. Jim scratched the dog behind the ears. "You're abandoned too, are you, boy?" So you can see that the story time, like the in the scene, is basically the same things are happening, but the discourse slows down to zoom in on more details about the bench, more details about the path, more details about the dog. So it slows it down, okay? And sometimes we want this because there's something significant about the setting or about another character that we want to highlight, okay? So this description is an important narrative device, but you just want to be cognizant of not overusing it to the point that you slow down the pacing of the entire novel. Try to focus on scenes where the story time and the narrating or discourse time seem relatively equal so that readers feel like they're experiencing it in real time. Now here's another, it's called commentary. Commentary is when there is no story. It's just narration. It's not even narration. It's just commentating. It's a narrator stepping out or breaking the veil to come out and say something that doesn't have representation in the story. So here's an example, okay? Jim, who sat alone on a park bench after his date with Eleanor, was like many young men today. He thought he knew how to make a woman happy because he'd watched movies and read a few books. He thought he knew how to connect with women because he had a mother. But like so many other men, Jim had been fashioned by societal institutions to infuriate the very people whose admiration he sought. So that's a very obtrusive, outspoken narrator who's making a comment, making observation and judgment about a character. Nothing is happening, okay? Now, this used to be in style. I would say back in the 1950s and 1960s, there were a lot of novels written where the narrator kind of breaks through the veil to talk about the characters. And so that's fine if that's the kind of style you're writing in, but I wouldn't do it if it were me. Unless you're writing something literary where meta stories are kind of like important to your theme, I would try to avoid too much commentary. Readers don't want to be told what to think about the characters. They want to be shown what to think about them, okay? So this is another example of telling and not showing. And then the final narrative device is the ellipsis. And this is where there's no discourse time. We just jump ahead. Things have happened in the world of the characters. Maybe whole years have gone by, but there's no representation of it in the discourse time or the narration. And here's an example. An hour after his date with Eleanor had ended, Jim returned to his apartment with a stray dog he'd found at the park. So we don't get to see him actually sitting on the bench, pondering, thinking about his date, wondering where things went wrong, and noticing this dog approach none of that. We don't get to see any of that. It happened in the world of the story and the characters, but it's not represented by the discourse, by the narration, okay? Now, this is something that you want to avoid if you have an important scene that's going to illuminate something about your character or your plot, okay? This is an example of telling. But this is an excellent way to transition between scenes when something is going on in the story that's not that important. It's just time is passing and you need to be able to record it or show it in some way. So ellipsis is a very important technique, but it's not one that you want to dominate your narrative structure because, again, it's more telling. So we want to make sure that scenes are what you use for your foundation, right? Add summary and ellipsis to transition. Use description when you want to zoom in on something that's really important to your story. And commentary should be used sparingly for reflection, if at all, okay? Balance is key. I also want to mention that we should avoid extremes. When I teach creative writing at Trinity, my students often err on one side or the other of this extreme. They either want to use too much ellipsis and minimalism. They want to use what Ernest Hemingway called the tip of the iceberg, where you tell the tip of the iceberg and you imply what's going on under here. Problem is, sometimes that can be too esoteric and so that readers are stuck trying to decode the story and not really understanding what's going on. It can go wrong for you. So you want to make sure that you're not so minimalistic that the story is undecipherable, okay? But sometimes readers err on the other side where they're just overly information dumping, just telling us so much, filling in too many details that they don't allow things to be subtly implied and picked up on by readers. That's a huge pleasure that readers have, is when they pick up on things, subtle things, and not have them slammed down their throat. So you want to try to find a happy balance between telling enough or showing enough and telling too much, okay? So again, scenes are showing. The others are telling, but useful devices to connect scenes. So I hope this was helpful. If you think so, please like, subscribe, hit the bell so you can be notified when a new video is released. Don't forget to grab my free guide, The Science of Story. I'll link it down in the description below. Also, let me know what you struggle with most when it comes to writing your story. Do you feel that you're not finding the right balance between showing and telling, or knowing when to use each? I'd love to hear from you. And thanks again for watching the Writing Lab. Keep writing. Bye-bye.